Hello, my friends. It's Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast, and I have no idea how long it's going to take us to do the thing that I want to do today. Each of these 4 books of the New Testament, the first 4 books, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, they're all about Jesus. They all tell roughly the same story with different points of emphasis between them. Each of them is written to a different audience, but if you're relatively new to the Bible, it can be a touch confusing when you're like, okay, I opened the thing up, I'm looking through the old stuff. Jesus is really important in the Bible, right? And I've been reading for a really long time, and he hasn't come up yet. Where do we get to the Jesus? Okay, I'm going to Google that. When does Jesus get into the Bible? Oh, wow, I got it way up here. Okay, I'll just turn way up here then. Just a second. Okay, wow, that's a lot. Okay, and then you read all the way through the book of Matthew, and you're like, okay, I think I get it. Let's see what happens next. And then you read through Mark, and you're like, this feels like the same thing. And then Luke again, and then John again. First time through, that could be really, really confusing. Well, we've talked before about the reasons that those are all there. They're all written to different audiences. They all have a different point of theological emphasis. Yesterday, we were comparing 2 of those. One of the really huge themes of Matthew is that the life and work and words and death and resurrection of Jesus, it's all fulfillment of the Old Testament. So he's writing to Jewish people who would know what the Old Testament is, or the scriptures as they would have called it, and they wanted to see it fulfilled. Like, round that out for me. Oh, I want to know. I'm not interested in any of your religious stuff unless it deals with that. So Matthew's pointing that stuff out. Luke, on the other hand, as we discussed yesterday, is really interested in the vindication of Jesus. Like, he was wrongly convicted. He actually was who he said he was. He was actually good in every way, and it was the government who got that one wrong. And you should think of Jesus rightly as who he claimed to be, because he is vindicated in the fact that he defeated death. And Mark and John have different points of emphasis as well. Matthew's big point of emphasis is fulfillment. I mean, there's a lot of stuff, the idea of the kingdom, but even then, the kingdom is this loose end that's hanging around from what we call the Old Testament, what they would have called the scriptures. Even the notion of a kingdom would have been like, well, yeah, we're supposed to have one of those, but we don't, because Rome came along, and now we have this weird, like, half Roman, half foreign regional royal house, I just did 3 halves. I understand the mathematical problems with that. Roman occupier situation, and none of it involves an independent kingdom. There's no room for a Messiah to come back. And so Matthew's audience, they would have been really interested in the sense of, God promised through all of the stories and all of the people in the Old Testament that there was supposed to be a king, and there was supposed to be a kingdom, and they were supposed to last forever, and it was supposed to be better than like any kingdom or any king that we've ever heard of, ever. It's supposed to come from the line of David, and I just don't see how that would possibly happen. Well, Matthew is here to say it did happen, it is happening, and it's going to be completely realized in Christ and the kingdom that he's initiating, and the kingship that he has. So from the very beginning, we see all of these points of emphasis, even using the word fulfillment. And I think there are roughly 50 smoking gun style. I use that expression all the time. I think that is one that was old when I heard old people use it when I was a kid. You get that, right? It's like a reference to the old murder mystery, whodunit, cop caper shows. We're like, we need evidence, and if you can find like a gun and the gun is still smoking and the guy's still holding it, it's like, that guy's guilty because the gun's still. I mean, you probably know this, but I use that expression a lot. And if you're not a native English speaker or you haven't been around long, then hopefully now we're all on the same page. Some of these are smoking gun. Looky here. The Old Testament said this, Jesus is this, he is the fulfillment of the thing kind of fulfillments. But a bunch of other things throughout the book of Matthew are much more subtle. What you're seeing is more of a completion of a story, or a new way to fully understand the richness of a character and a situation in the Old Testament in light of what the same God is doing now through the work of Christ. Sometimes it's even more subtle than that, just in that there's symmetry between an Old Testament story and a New Testament story that is meant to take what the Old Testament story evokes, what it brings to mind. For example, God's sovereignty, even when he appears silent in the book of Esther, and God's ability to steer the hearts of kings and governments, and even those things, so they seem like the most powerful entities on earth, are not more powerful than him. And even if it looks like all hope is absolutely lost, God is still the deliverer, the king who defeats death. And this is all exemplified by the fact that Haman in the book of Esther built a bunch of gallows, and he was going to kill all the Jewish people. And instead, Haman gets justice. He ends up swinging on his own gallows. Well, so Judas ends up swinging on his own gallows, quite literally. Is that an accident? No, I don't think so. And it kind of explains why other books that deal with Judas's death handle it a little bit differently than Matthew does, because Matthew, again, would be more interested in pointing out this symmetry, this fulfillment theme between an Old Testament story like Haman swinging on his own gallows with Judas swinging on his own gallows. Then you got another kind of fulfillment that comes up in the book of Matthew, and this is usually a type of fulfillment that Jesus is negatively directing at the Pharisees. It's most evident in a chapter we just worked through a little bit ago, Matthew chapter 23, where he's calling out the Pharisees for all of their horrible behavior. And then the culminating remarks are that you are the inheritors of the evil deeds that your forefathers carried out against God's prophets. Now, Jesus had hinted at these themes earlier with parables in Jerusalem about wicked tenants who beat and kill the representatives of the king, including, the landlord in the metaphor, including the son of the landlord. And it's not an accident that Matthew emphasizes those points where Jesus even demonstrates that his enemies are a fulfillment of the Old Testament enemies, and the way that the bad people who are wrong and trying to thwart the plans of God behave in the Old Testament, so their descendants behave in the exact same way now. Not maybe literal descendants, but vocational descendants, spiritual descendants. And then there's also the level of fulfillment that is most on display in Matthew chapter 5, where Jesus says that he's not here to abolish the law, but then to fulfill it. And he goes through and he highlights a bunch of things from the Old Testament where it's like, hey, you've heard that it was said, don't do this, but I tell you. And then he takes it even deeper down to the level of the heart, down to the level of the kingdom value. And in doing so, he's saying that this kingdom value, this right attitude before God that bleeds over into how you treat others, that this is a fulfillment of what was written down even in the law of the Old Testament. But then there's all of the legal fulfillment that involves the role of Jesus and who he is as well, the way he just fits lock and key into that Old Testament sacrificial system, the idea that certain stuff had to die in order to stay the wrath of a righteous and perfect God, and then Christ is going to the cross to give his life as a ransom for many. There's just a ton going on here, but to just think of Matthew in terms of, in the Old Testament, it said there will be a guy who does this thing. Then in the New Testament, Jesus is the guy who did that thing. Then it said that in the Old Testament, there'll be a guy who'll be standing here in this town, and he shall say the following words while wearing the following outfit. Then Jesus was in that town and said those words, then wore that outfit. I mean, that's awesome when that stuff happens, but it's actually far more profound when you sit and think about it for a while, that he completes all of the arcs of a gigantic multi-thousand-year, all of history-long story. It seems at first glance like the literal fulfillment stuff would be the tough one, but when you really step back and think about it, it is an even more amazing task that he is the fulfillment and completion of the entire story of everything. And I think that's what is being referenced in Matthew chapter 26, when Jesus tells Peter to put away your sword. Don't you think I can call down a whole bunch of angels from my Father if I wanted to? And then when he says, but how then would the scriptures be fulfilled that say it must happen this way? And again, a second later, he says, but this has all taken place that the writings of the prophets might be fulfilled. This is a bit of a spike of the football for Matthew, and I think for Jesus as well. When he goes to the cross here in a little bit and he says, it is finished, he's talking about, his redemptive work on the cross and all of that. But in the context of Matthew, he's also talking about the completion of all of these stories. All of these loose ends are now seeing their resolution. Now you can look back at all those stories and be like, oh, okay. the whole Kaiser Sose thing, it all just came into focus all at once. It's a quattro the board. It's a quartet. Whoa, this is unbelievable. And everything comes into focus and it all clicks for the first time ever. That is the moment that's happening here at the end of Matthew chapter 26. And so, yes, we're heading to something tragic and sad, but also you and I, as people who've journeyed through this book very slowly together, we should be able to appreciate how amazing it is on all the levels that these loose ends are tied up in Jesus as his hands are tied up in the garden. We'll look at more specifics about that mañana. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.